Okay, let's discuss the Lindsay Clancy case and what a difficult decision the jurors have to make. To be honest, I do not envy them at this point. So, in your opinion, did the Commonwealth prove without a reasonable doubt that Lindsay Clancy is guilty? Here are the five options. Number one, guilty of first degree murder. Number two, guilty of second degree murder. Number three, manslaughter. Number four, not guilty by reason of lack of criminal responsibility, meaning was or is she insane? Number five, not guilty. The judge goes over his instructions for the jurors, and I'll add clips here. Let me also add that this case has been a heavy one. A lot of people have been discussing it and disagreeing with everything. I mean, shit, that's okay. We can agree to disagree, but respectfully. Mental health is not taken seriously enough, in my opinion. And doctors do need to become more educated on postpartum and the different forms of postpartum. I myself haven't ever experienced it, so I am in fact ignorant on the symptoms people experience while going through it. It's hard for me to understand how a mother can harm or unalive their fleshing blood that they birthed. But I've been listening to this case with an open mind the best that I can. Did Lindsay suffer from postpartum? I myself think she struggled with a mental illness, I won't deny that. But was she in psychosis at the time she strangled the children? I can't say she was, to be honest, but that's just my opinion. Regardless, let's not forget the babies that no longer have the chance to grow up because their mother took that right away from them. Cora, she was 5 years old. Dawson, he was 3 years old. And Callan, he was 8 months old. May all three rest in peace. Okay, here goes the clips of what the judge expects from jurors with making their decision after hearing everything.
These charges have specific factual elements that the Commonwealth must establish beyond a reasonable doubt, and I'll review those elements with you in detail at this time. Now remember that the law presumes the defendant to be innocent of the charges against her. This presumption of innocence is a rule of law that compels you to find the defendant not guilty unless and until the Commonwealth produces evidence from whatever source that proves that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. In this case, Ms. Clancy is charged with 3 counts of murder. I want to talk first about the issue of criminal responsibility. All right. Now, to prove the defendant guilty of any crime, the Commonwealth must first prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was criminally responsible at the time the alleged crime was committed. The Commonwealth bears the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the crime with which he is charged and also that the defendant is criminally responsible for her conduct. The defendant has no burden to prove a lack of criminal responsibility. Criminal responsibility is a legal term. A person is not criminally responsible for her conduct if she has a mental disease or defect, and as a result of that mental disease or defect, she lacks the substantial capacity either to appreciate the criminality or wrongfulness of her conduct or to conform her conduct to the requirements of the law. The phrase mental disease or defect is a legal term, not a medical term. It need not fit into a formal medical diagnosis. The phrase mental disease or defect does not include any abnormality characterized only by repeated criminal conduct. It is for you to determine in light of all the evidence whether the defendant had a mental disease or defect. If the Commonwealth has proved to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was not suffering from a mental disease or defect at the time of the killing, the Commonwealth has satisfied its burden of proving that the defendant was criminally responsible. If the Commonwealth has not proved to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was not suffering from a mental disease or defect at the time of the killing, then you must consider whether as a result of a mental disease or defect, the defendant lacked the substantial capacity either to appreciate the criminality or wrongfulness of her conduct or to conform her conduct to the requirements of the law. To establish that the defendant had the substantial capacity to conform her conduct to the requirements of the law, the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that any mental disease or defect that may have existed did not deprive the defendant of her ability to behave as the law requires. That is, the word appreciate means to understand rather than merely to know. Criminality means the legal significance of conduct. Wrongfulness means the moral significance. The Commonwealth must prove that the defendant knew and understood that her conduct was illegal or that it was wrong. It's not enough for the Commonwealth to show that the defendant merely knew or was intellectually aware that her conduct was illegal or wrong. Rather, the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a mental disease or defect did not deprive the defendant of a meaningful understanding of the legal or moral significance of her conduct. The defendant must have been able to realize in some meaningful way that her conduct was illegal or wrong. In considering whether the Commonwealth has met its burden of proof, you may consider all the evidence that's been presented at this trial. You may consider the facts underlying the crime and evidence of the defendant's actions before and after the crime. you may consider the opinions of any experts who testified and give those opinions whatever weight you think they deserve. Remember that the Commonwealth must prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was criminally responsible at the time that the crime was committed. That is, that the defendant did not lack criminal responsibility at that time. Therefore, it is the Commonwealth's burden to prove at least one of the following beyond a reasonable doubt. One, that at the time of the alleged crime, the defendant did not suffer from a mental disease or defect. Or two, that if the defendant did suffer from a mental disease or defect, she nonetheless retained a substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness or criminality of her conduct and to conform her conduct to the requirements of the law. Now, as I previously instructed you, your decision should be based solely on the evidence and the law of this case. If a defendant is found not guilty by reason of lack of criminal responsibility, the district attorney or another appropriate authority may, and generally does, petition the court to commit the defendant to a mental health facility or to Bridgewater State Hospital. If the court concludes that the defendant is mentally ill and that her discharge would create a substantial likelihood of serious harm to herself or others, then the court will grant the petition and commit the defendant to a proper mental health facility or to Bridgewater State Hospital. First, about murder in the first degree. The defendant is charged with 3 separate indictments charging murder, 1 count each relating to Cora Clancy, Dawson Clancy, and Callan Clancy. The instructions I'm going to give now apply to each separate indictment relating to each child. There are 2 different degrees of murder. There's murder in the first degree and there's murder in the second degree. If you find the defendant guilty of murder, you shall decide the degree of murder. The Commonwealth alleges that the defendant committed murder in the first degree on the following theories. First, that it was murder with deliberate premeditation, and then second, and or it was murder with extreme atrocity or cruelty. To find the defendant guilty on any of these theories of murder, you must be unanimous. That is, all of the deliberating jurors must agree that the Commonwealth has met its burden of proving every required element of that theory beyond a reasonable doubt. If you're unable to agree unanimously that the Commonwealth has met its burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt either of these theories of first-degree murder, you shall consider whether the Commonwealth has proved the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of murder in the second degree. So I'm going to begin by instructing you on the elements and the additional requirements of proof for each of these theories of murder in the first degree. And then I'll instruct you on murder in the second degree. All right. So number 1, I'll first define the elements of murder in the first degree with deliberate premeditation. To prove the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree with deliberate premeditation, the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt the following elements. 1, the defendant caused the death of Cora Clancy, Dawson Clancy, and or Callan Clancy. 2, the defendant intended to kill Cora Clancy, Dawson Clancy, and or Callan Clancy. That is, the defendant consciously and purposefully intended to cause Cora Clancy's, Dawson Clancy's, and or Callan Clancy's death. And 3, that the defendant committed the killing with deliberate premeditation. That is, she decided to kill after a period of reflection. I'll now discuss each of these requirements in more detail. The first element is that the defendant caused the death of Cora, Dawson, and or Callan Clancy. A defendant's act is the cause of death, where the act in a natural and continuous sequence results in death, and without which death would not have occurred. The second element is that the defendant intended to kill Cora Clancy, Dawson Clancy, and or Callan Clancy. That is, the defendant consciously and purposefully intended to cause the death. The third element is that the defendant committed the killing with deliberate premeditation. That is, she decided to kill after a period of reflection. Deliberate premeditation does not require any particular length of time of reflection. A decision to kill may be formed over a period of days, hours, or even seconds. The key is the sequence of the thought process. And it would be first, the consideration whether to kill, second, the decision to kill, and third, the killing arising from that decision. There is no deliberate premeditation where the action is taken so quickly that a defendant takes no time to reflect on the action and then to decide to do it. In deciding whether the defendant intended to kill the deceased and whether she formed that intent with deliberate premeditation, you may consider any credible evidence that the defendant suffered from a mental impairment or was affected by her consumption of prescription drugs. This theory of murder in the first degree, regardless of whether or not you find that the Commonwealth has proved murder in the first degree with deliberate premeditation, which I just discussed. To prove the defendant guilty of murder with extreme atrocity or cruelty, the Commonwealth must prove the following elements beyond a reasonable doubt. 1, that the defendant caused the death of Cora Clancy, Dawson Clancy, and or Callan Clancy. Second element, the defendant either A, intended to kill Cora, Dawson, and or Callan Clancy. B, she intended to cause grievous bodily harm to Cora, Dawson, and or Callan Clancy. Or C, intended to do an act which in the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result. The third element was that the killing was committed with extreme atrocity and cruelty. Extreme atrocity or cruelty, I'm sorry. All right. So that's my instructions on the specific elements of the charges in this case.